Hello, friends. You have found yourself tuned in to Reflections, a program sponsored by Paducah Cooperative Ministry, where together we do God's work with human hands, and we discuss a variety of things each week. And today we have a special program. I'm going to let Gregory tell us about that, but I am Karen Winkel. I'm the pastor at United Church of Paducah, and my partner here is Gregory Waldrop, who's pastor at Fountain Avenue United Methodist Church. And Gregory, I will just let you do a little talking.
Great.
Tell us about today.
Super. I'm glad to be here with you, Karen. I'm glad you all are with us as well. We are in the middle of an election season. We're within a month of elections, and we're going to tackle the topic of spiritual leadership in the seasons of elections. We have an interesting nation and an interesting relationship between church and state established by statute, and living under that is always an interesting issue in the conversation. And so we have with us today two people to help us join in that conversation. We're glad to have Father Pat Reynolds from St. Thomas More Catholic Church. Welcome, Father Pat.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Greg and Karen.
We also have a lay person, Ray McLennan, whose church is the Heartland Worship Center, the Bible Baptist Church, a strong church in our community. Ray is a retired IRS agent and one who has a passion and a deep and abiding professional and personal interest in this topic, and we're glad you're with us, Ray.
Right. I want to emphasize I am retired. I'm not represent the IRS today.
That's an important thing. Tell us just a little bit about each of you, just what you're doing now and where you are and the ministries and or activities in retirement you're a part of. Father Pat?
Well, I am a pastor at St. Thomas More Catholic Church on Blandville Road, right up from where we're taping today, and have been there a little over 3 years, and just celebrated my 26th year in ministry. I was just a mere youth when I was ordained, and I've been involved with parish life mostly over these years as an associate pastor for about 6 years, and pastor at 4 different sites, and then also in the midst of that went away to do some graduate studies, postgraduate studies in Washington, D.C. at Catholic University. So I have a degree in church law, or canon law as we call it. So in my days in Owensboro, I was head of our diocesan tribunal, so we handled a lot of disputes, and mostly marriage nullity issues, but other disputes. And when we start talking about people's marriages, you get lots of phone calls, and lots of opinions, and lots of unresolved issues in people's lives. So, yeah, you're right. We are in an election season, and I think everything that you could run for in Kentucky is on the ballot.
It is, yeah.
This year. And also had some background of one who was in a political family, so I kind of know from the other side of what it is to run for office, and not personally, but my dad. So it was a real family thing. So I might address some of those things in our half hour with you.
Super, super. Ray, tell us about yourself.
Well, like I said, I retired recently in March for 29 years with the Internal Revenue Service. I'm a member of Heartland Worship Center. I guess an unofficial advisor to the elders there sometimes on some technical issues, especially involving 501c3 status organizations and all. I'm currently managing a campaign for a gentleman that's running for Court of Appeals. Shay Nichols is running for Court of Appeals, and I'm managing his campaign. I'm a member of the Democratic Executive Committee here in McCracken County. So I get active on that end, plus, socially try to get involved with different issues and all.
Great. Well, the credentials sound great. Let's dive right in about this notion of spiritual leadership in the middle of election season.
Well, I think as a pastor, you have to address issues that are present among us, and I think we become victims of 15-second sound bites from people, and there's so much negative campaigning that we see in our midst that it sours a lot of people, I think, on politics, especially when there's so much mud throwing. But you know, I think the history of this country, several hundred years, has been lots of mud throwing, but we seem to think it gets worse each year, but I'm not sure if that's true. We get sick of it, I think, in every election cycle.
I get,
But-
excuse me, I get sort of interested. You talked about that people say, I hear people saying all the time, we can't legislate morality. Well, that is exactly what we legislate all the time. That is completely what legislation does. It determines and sets boundaries and limits on our relationships, which is the moral world, which is the moral reality. It is impossible for churches that take seriously moral life and faithfulness not to have some opinions.
Yeah, the political arena is also the moral arena because it deals with people's rights and privileges and relationships and ultimately the dignity of the human person. And so, I mean, that's the foundation of what morality is all about, and it's what politics seeks to do too, to help people who comprise our nation and government. So, yeah, morality always fits in.
Yeah.
So how to speak to the issues of the day, whether those are just in the mix or whether those issues come forward as the result of an election season, how to speak to those issues of the day in a way that's responsible. I had a conversation with a fellow who was not anymore part of the church, and he was very frank in telling me why he had left, and that was that his pastor was, in his mind, becoming increasingly political, rather than asking questions, was maybe advocating a particular stance, and from the pulpit was telling people how to vote. And that begs the question, what are we called to, and where do we draw the line, I guess? How do you handle that in the preaching that you're called to do?
Well, I think, you know, if you look at any of the Old Testament prophecies, it's all about justice. And so we have to be faithful to the scriptures. And Jesus quoted the prophets so much, and his life was one of justice. And I think you can be political, but not partisan. You know, there's a big difference. And I think we can be very clear about how we are to act without, supporting someone by name or a party by name.
Well, and that's an interesting question.
Well, that's what in 1954 Congress introduced legislation that basically one of their comments was, what was interesting, is they did not want the public's faith in churches and other nonprofit organizations to be eroded by being a political arm of a political organization. That's why they introduced in 1954 legislation that said, hey, we can't tell you what to say, but if you want your contributions to your church to be tax deductible, these are the rules that you must follow. You cannot intervene in elections. You cannot speak for or against any candidate. You cannot use your facilities to facilitate that situation. In 1987, they came back and increased that. They didn't lighten it. They increased that, increased the penalties against doing that. They didn't say you can't talk about issues. What they said you can't do is you can't get involved in partisan politics. Contributions to political candidates are not deductible. So therefore, they did not want, with all the money that's being spent on candidates. I mean, the last figure was that there was over $20 billion in the last election cycle that was spent nationwide on elections, and they didn't want this money going into the church to erode people's perception and their trust in their religious organizations.
Does that, I understand the work and word against supporting candidates. What about, does it support the single issue things like gambling referendums and liquor by the drink kind of referendums? What is that a different?
There's two parts to that. One, you can talk about issues and your situation on that. But when you get to legislation, the difference is you can speak about it, but you cannot use any money to promote legislation or oppose legislation. They cannot use any of your tax-exempt dollars, significant dollars, to spend for that. You can do your opinion on it differently than when you're political candidates, but you can't go out and have your church put out church bulletins and use your church facilities for rallies against any legislation. So yes, you can speak for items that may be on legislation. You can always speak for issues, and churches have consistently spoke about abortion, gay marriages, and other social issues we have like that with no problem about it, as long as they don't make it one, candidate or party specific, or number two, use any money to promote any particular proposed or pending legislation.
So a rally, even a rally held at a church in favor of a constitutional amendment,
That would
be
probably constitute spending money for it. You'd probably have to have somebody clean up afterwards. You'd have utilities involved and all. Would be against that.
be against the law.
That's
It would
right.
be to retain the separation of church
Right.
and state.
I mean, you could still get up on Sunday and or any programs
Right.
you may have and say that you're opposed
This
to
is
this
the
or
official
whatever. That's fine, as
denominational
long as you don't
stance.
spend any dollars. That's the difference.
Yeah.
You can't spend dollars for legislation, but you can't speak for any particular for or against any particular candidate.
That's interesting. You can't be for or you can't oppose a candidate. Either
That's
one.
right.
Either
Right. In
one.
1987, they came back and said, hey, this restriction we put in is not only endorsing a candidate, it's also speaking against a candidate.
Well, it's a very interesting dilemma. I mean, or not dilemma maybe, but it is an interesting discipline to have to live under. Again, given the very clear requirements in the biblical text about moral living, righteousness, about stances about justice and life and vitality, and yet to retain this kind of status, this particular status, there's laws that govern that.
And like I said, what they were worried about was that if you got involved in partisan politics, that it would erode people's faith in those organizations. That's what Congress's main concern was.
So how often is it that the IRS pursues a situation in which a church is abusing its privileges?
In 2004, they examined 200 churches.
200 churches in
200 churches
2004.
nationwide from complaints they received and all. And they examined about 200 other non-church but 501c3 organizations on complaints. They had a 22% no change rate. That means that 22% of the time the complaint was unfounded. 78% of the time it was either a minor or a major infraction of the law.
And
So
would
that-
tax-exempt status be taken away from some of those?
It could be. It could, based on how grievous the situation was, if they had done it over and over again. Situation. And some 501c3 organizations have said, forget it. We just won't be tax exempt. That way we can get up and be as partisan as we want to be.
Right, and I think sometimes churches think they have the right. I mean, the right to be tax exempt. It's a privilege our country gives to
Right.
invest in churches. So we didn't earn it. It's a privilege.
Well, let me push this a little bit because I think one of the more interesting or the more difficult struggles that I have is that my experience is in terms of the moral issues that I really care about and count on and take note of. Genuinely, neither of the political offerings embody it all. I have to look somewhere for the people that uphold some pieces, abortion and all those kind of issues, and I have to look to another party who take care of the most vulnerable among us. And it's a difficult call. I mean, I'm wondering if anybody else has this struggle.
Oh, I think so. I mean, just comparing the candidates in the 2004 presidential race, and there was just, It's funny how political races can make people just vitriolic. I mean, just bring out the worst in them, you know, and anger and accusing of somebody if they vote for this person or that, or somebody becomes the child of the devil. Or, but you know, I read an article in one of it was a Catholic magazine, but why somebody was going to vote for Bush, and then another one by somebody who was going to vote for, why they were going to vote for Kerry, based on some of these fundamental justice issues. And then another one that said, why I can't vote for either one of them, because they listed just some egregious things they thought in both their records. So, I mean, if we applied Catholic social teaching to a candidate, nobody seems to fit, you know? Somebody who is going to take care of the vulnerable and the poor, and who's against capital punishment, and doesn't think that, you know, preemptive war fits into our just war tradition at all, and someone who is also against abortion and who's against capital punishment, well, you can say, oh, that's a Republican. And someone say, well, no, those are Democratic things. Well, no, they're just the inherent rights of individuals, you know, that we protect people's dignity. So sometimes, Greg, it probably does seem like, you know, you're weighing and evaluating. Another interesting thing is, too, I mean, our church, like many churches, are very much in favor of right to life. And of course, that's a big spectrum, too. That's not just the unborn, but we focus certainly a lot on, I mean, a person has to see the light of day first. But will this candidate also support the programs that will take care of this child born into very poor situations? And, you know, I was reading, like in the District of Columbia, just maybe 3 or 4 years ago, that the abortion rate has gone up, I think because of legislation that has reduced aid to dependent children, or after maybe 2 children, no more. And something else that was interesting, that some of what we consider pro-life administrations against pro-choice administration, that sometimes the abortion rate was higher under the pro-life, maybe because some of those programs weren't in place. I was just very startled to read, and I'm hoping that they were accurate articles and statistics. But I mean, you've got to talk the talk, and then you have to walk the walk, and make sure that we protect all vulnerable people.
Right.
And it's, you know, politics is hard.
Right.
It's
Well,
hard.
that's one thing that bothers me, is that we have a tendency, I've seen people and I've talked to them about why they voted for candidates, and it's always about what the candidate says. When I asked them, what's his voting record on that? How many bills has he introduced, has his staff actually wrote down and introduced, that would reduce the number of abortions, that would reduce, you know, the possibility of gay marriages, whatever the issue is. You know, I mean, this person, unless it's not an incumbent, but if it's an incumbent, there's a written record there of their stance on these issues. And a lot of times what I find is the only time I see this candidate interested in this issue is when he's running for office. When I go back and look at the congressional record, or the in Frankfurt, the legislative report there, I don't see any bills that he's introduced. He may sign on somebody else's to look good, but he didn't put his time and effort to have his staff sit down and write about an issue, then his heart's not there. So what I look is what that candidate's staff has worked on, what he's actually worked on, is where his heart is. And that's how I believe people should vote, based on what your elected official does, not what he says.
Well, it's occurring to me as we talk about people of faith voting for candidates whose actions do or don't reflect the values of our faith. Part of the challenge is, I think, even to consider anew what our values are and who our Savior is. I think there's a lot of diversity of opinion when we talk about who Jesus was and what he stood for. How that gets expressed in the social arena,
Right,
because
public area.
because it's not uncommon for me to hear a candidate who's speaking to a Christian gathering. It's not uncommon for me to wonder whether he and I even have the same Jesus. And so I think there's a responsibility from the pulpit, at least, to ask some questions about who this Savior is and what he is about. Father Pat, maybe you can speak to that a little bit, because I find myself struggling with that as a person of faith.
I picked up a book this summer and by Jim Wallace from Sojourners, and it's called God's Politics: Why the Right Gets It Wrong and Why the Left Doesn't Get It. And talking about how a moral or religious agenda might be set by one side, but there's no response from the other, or they don't know how to engage into it. But it was just pretty fascinating that someone can stress their religiosity. I think people want to hear a candidate's faith. They want to hear about their involvement in religion, or what God means to them, what faith means to them, or a relationship with Christ if they're Christian. And I think candidates shouldn't be afraid to do that. People are hungry to hear it. Allow them on, and they'll evoke church, and state and separation, but people vote for an individual, and for policies, but also for their integrity and their honesty. And if a person expresses their faith, then I have a window into who this person is and how he or she might be voting in the future. So,
yeah, I think the whole notion of separation of church and state was all about, I've said this before, but it was all about protecting the church, really, from the overwhelming pressures of complying to the state. I mean, there's plenty of protection in the state, and with all the elections, with all the representatives, there's plenty of protection for the state from any undue religious influence. They've been able to handle all sorts of ideas and all sorts of different perspectives. But really, the whole church and state thing was not to keep the state from listening to religious ideas and even acting out of them. It was to keep the state from imposing a particular kind of religion on churches in any case. So I think you're making that same point, that it really is about public policy. How do we make clear our vision to make real the kind of world, the biblical world imagines?
right. And most of the candidates we vote for are not running the country. They're in small positions in our city or in our county, but we do want them to be men and women of integrity, and it's okay for them to talk about their faith too, and how they might be involved in community and what type of service or social justice projects they've been involved in. People want to know that. They want to know that their candidates and people they'll vote for are people who also walk the walk.
Right.
But how about when we have a conflict, when one of them will not fit our faith, but as a elected official govern how your tax dollars are spent and running the government, it may be a better candidate in that situation. Is it all right to be selfish when you vote? You may have a candidate running that may be opposed to a couple issues of faith that you have, but personally, that you may work for the government, they may protect your benefits, they may reduce your taxes so you can have more money to spend in your family and all, and you may feel like it's okay to be selfish to vote for this individual that may a betterment that you think is going to better you and your family.
Or the role that they're running for in that elected position, they'll never have it doesn't involve voting for some of those major issues either.
Right.
So it might just be taking care of your money and making sure it's spent well, locally.
But we have a bunch of people that vote on one issue only.
Right.
And that scares me. Because if you follow that path, in my opinion, it's following the path of following like Hitler and how Hitler came to power in Germany before World War II. It was all economic, so they didn't care what political thing he was thinking. He was promising them to improve their prosperity, and they followed him to disaster.
Right. You mentioned one of the books you were reading is God's Politics by Jim Wallace. Is there any other books? One of the things we've been doing is sharing books we've been reading. It doesn't particularly have to be about this topic, but is there a book either of you have been reading, any of us have read lately that we'd like to highlight for our readers?
I have to travel to Owensboro periodically, so I get some books on disc, and just finished reading Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat, which is pretty fascinating about moving into the 21st century and global politics and just how we're affected by people in other countries now, and how far we're falling behind, and what we need to be spending tax dollars on to improve our own, and how we need to be more creative. That part of our American background is being ingenious and creative, and we can lament the fact that a lot of jobs that have been safe and secure the past decades are now going overseas, but this is the time for us to be ingenious and to be creative. And it there was just one little section too that I found it was interesting, that our generation, our kids, who are often spoiled and we've done so much for them, in 10 years, they might have bosses who are from China or India, and who have a very strong work ethic. And, what are we doing to prepare our kids for this? So I just found it was a real fascinating read, and about how the internet has changed our life, too.
Do you have a book that you've been reading of late?
Most books I read are very partisan politically. but it is an interesting issue about how different, how many candidates address these problems? How many candidates talk about the bigger picture? It seems like we have a tendency, in my opinion, to elect some narrow-minded politicians based on what they say and what they do, and just people that look at the whole picture and our whole society.
I just finished a novel too. I just thought of it, called The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, and it's about Afghanistan, which of course has been so much in our news, and I didn't know much about Afghanistan, and so and we had a bishop who gave us a retreat one time who said that preachers need to read more novels, see movies, and read poetry. You need that creative part of your brain to be engaged and to work, and I think it makes sense. But just to learn more about the geography and the culture and Islam and all those things that are within that novel, I found pretty fascinating too. Just the problems that poor country's had in the past 30, 40 years.
Well, we're at the close of our time.
Quick.
It's gone by in a hurry, and it's certainly a topic that is on our minds and deserves our attention and our discernment as people of faith, isn't it?
You bet. You bet. I think we're all going to be wrestling with these things for quite some time. I'll close out if that's okay. We're so glad that you've joined us, and we encourage you to be in conversation with us. You can send an email to us at pcm@hcis.net, and in the subject line put reflections and offer a comment or ask a question or give us a suggestion for something that you would like to see covered in this program and this time that we spend with you. We're so glad that you have spent this time with us, and we hope that you join us in the future and that you participate with Paducah Cooperative Ministry in doing God's work with human hands. Thank you, and shalom.
Shalom.